Mark Ciampach, the author of Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition. In this lecture video, we'll talk about Chapter 14, Risk Mitigation. Controlling risk is a key to information security today, and one way to reduce risk is through the use of policies and procedures. In addition, proper awareness and training is critical if an organization or user is to stay secure. In this chapter, we will explore risk mitigation.
Chapter 14, Risk Mitigation, Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition. Let's see what we're going to accomplish in this lecture video. Our objectives are to be able to explain how to control risk, to list the types of security policies that relate to controlling risk, and to describe how awareness and training can likewise provide increased security. We'll begin with talking about controlling risk. We've spoken about risk in several previous chapters. Remember that risk is a concept that's at the very heart of information security. There is a multifaceted approach to information security. We can control risk through different management techniques, through developing a security policy, and through user awareness and training. So this multifaceted approach to dealing with risk can permeate the entire organization, and should. So let's talk about that to begin with, about controlling risk. A brief review of some terminology that we've spoken of before. You'll remember that a threat is a type of action that has the potential to cause harm. A threat agent is a person or an element that has the power to carry out a threat. A flaw or weakness that allows a threat agent to bypass security is what we call a vulnerability. And risk is the likelihood that a threat agent will exploit the vulnerability. Risk can be divided into several different classifications. This table lists those different classifications: strategic, compliance, financial, operational, environmental, technical, and managerial, with a description of each and an example. Three of the most common strategies for controlling risk are what are known as privilege management, change management, and incident management. Let's begin by talking about privilege management. Again, a bit of a review. A privilege is a subject's access level over an object, like the user's ability, let's say, to open a payroll file. Privilege management, then, is the process of assigning and revoking privileges to objects. It covers the procedures of managing object authorization. One element of privilege management is to periodically review a subject's privileges over an object, and we call that privilege auditing. Of course, as we said before, an audit is a methodical examination and review that produces a detailed report of its findings. Now, although audits are usually associated with reviewing financial practices, they certainly have a very important role in information technology, particularly auditing security functions as well. So audits serve to verify the security protections that an organization enacts are being followed, and that any corrective actions can be very quickly implemented before an attacker can exploit a vulnerability. It's very important to periodically examine a subject's privilege over an object to make sure the subject has the correct privileges, not too few certainly, and not too many. The correct privileges should follow the principle of least privilege, in which users are given only the minimal amount of privilege necessary to perform their job. Here's an example of a sample user access and right review. They'll be reviewed on a regular basis. Organization will institute a review of all network access rights every 6 months. Organization will institute a review of access to the applications once per year. The review will be conducted as follows. So, a summary here of how the organization is going to handle privilege management. A second means of controlling risk is change management. Now, change management refers to a methodology for making modifications and then keeping track of those changes. All too often, changes to network or systems are done on a very ad hoc type of basis where there's pressure to make an immediate change. That change is made to solve an immediate problem, but without proper change management, we don't know if this change can truly impact another change or if a future change will come back and negate the change that we've just made. So change management just seeks to approach changes systematically and provide the necessary documentation. Now, change management involves all types of changes to information systems, but two types of changes regarding security are outstanding. The first is any change in system architecture, maybe new services, routers, other equipment that's introduced into the network. These devices can serve as replacements for existing equipment or new equipment that's going to expand what our network can do. The second type of change is that of classification, which primarily refers to files or documents. The classification designations for a government document might be top secret, secret, confidential, unclassified. Other organizations may not have these four levels. They may simply call them standard document and confidential documents. But whatever the system of classification is used, it's important to clearly label the documents that are not intended for public use. Because of the impact of changes that can affect virtually all users, and because of the risk of uncoordinated changes resulting in security vulnerabilities, many organizations have what's called a CMT, a change management team. This team is responsible for overseeing changes. Any proposed change, addition, modification, relocation, removal, any proposed change of technical infrastructure, including an interruption of service, must be run through the CMT. The team typically is composed of representatives from IT, network security, and upper-level management. The CMT reviews proposed changes, ensures that the risk and impact of the changes are clearly understood, recommends approval or disapproval, deferral or withdrawal of the requested change, and communicates those proposed changes and approved changes to coworkers. Now, a third way in which we can try to control risk, besides privilege management, change management, is incident management. When an unauthorized incident occurs, a response is required. And incident management is defined as a framework and the functions required to enable an incident response and incident handling within the organization. Incident response is defined as the components required to identify, analyze, and contain the incident, while incident handling is the planning, coordination, communication, and planning functions that are needed to resolve the incident in an efficient manner. So incident management is just that framework and the functions required to enable incident response and incident handling within the organization. The objective of incident management is to restore normal operations as quickly as possible with the least possible impact on either the business or on the users. far in our conversation regarding risk management, we've talked about strategies for controlling risk, privilege management, change management, and incident management. Another means of reducing risk now, which we'll turn our attention to, is reducing risk through a security policy. It's important to know what a policy is, how to balance trust and control, understand the processes for designing a policy, and knowing what different types of policies are. Let's start with our definition. What exactly is a security policy? A security policy, in this context, is a document that outlines the protections that should be enacted to ensure that the organization's assets face minimal risk. Now, at one level, a policy can be seen as a set of management statements that defines the organization's philosophy as to how we're going to safeguard our information. Yet at a more technical and detailed level, that policy can be seen as the rules for computer access and how these are going to be carried out. So really, a security policy is a written document that says how an organization plans to protect the company's information technology assets. With that in mind, a security policy really can serve several functions. It can be an overall intention and direction that's formally expressed by the organization's management. In this sense, a policy then is a vehicle for communicating the organization's security culture and acceptable information security behavior. The policy also details specific risks and how to address them. It can provide controls that executives can use to direct employee behavior. Thirdly, the policy can really help create a security-aware organization culture and can help ensure that employee behavior is directed and monitored to ensure compliance with security requirements. Now, one of the issues of a security policy, and one of the challenges, is that of trust and control. That's because an effective security policy has to very carefully balance these two elements. There are really three approaches to trust. We've mentioned this before. We can trust everybody all the time. That's the easiest model to enforce because there are no restrictions, but of course very impractical. We can trust no one at any time. This is most restrictive, but generally impractical. Who would want to work for an organization that never trusted you under any circumstances? And the third option, we can trust some people some of the time. So with this third option, we're exercising caution in the amount of given trust. Access is provided as needed to ensure that trust is not violated. So where does the security policy fit in here? Security policy attempts to provide the right amount of trust by balancing no trust and too much trust. It does this by trusting some of the people some of the time and building trust over time. Deciding on the level of trust can be a delicate matter. Too much trust can lead to security problems. Too little trust makes it difficult to find and keep good employees. Now, control is the second element that really has to be balanced. One of the goals of a policy is to implement control. Deciding on the level of control for a specific policy is not always easy and not always clear. The security needs and the culture of the organization actually play a role in deciding what level of control is appropriate. Because if policies are too restricted or too hard to implement and comply with, what's going to happen? Well, employees will ignore them or simply find a way to circumvent them. So management has to commit to the proper level of control for security policy that it wants to address. Now, when it comes to designing security policy, let's first of all begin by talking about what exactly a policy is and then we'll look at the security policy cycle and the steps in a security policy. Different terms are used to describe rules that a user needs to follow in an organization. There are standards, there are guidelines, and there are policies. A standard is defined as a collection of requirements specific to the system or procedure that has to be met by everyone. A standard might describe how to secure a computer at home that remotely connects to the organization's network. Users simply have to follow the standard if they want to be able to connect to the organization's network remotely. A guideline, on the other hand, is a collection of suggestions that should be implemented. They're not requirements, but they could be strongly recommended. A policy is a document that outlines specific requirements or rules that must be met. So we can see that a policy differs from a standard and a guideline. A policy usually has characteristics like these. They communicate a consensus of judgment. They define appropriate behavior for users. They identify tools and procedures that are needed. They can provide directives for human resource action in response to inappropriate behavior. And a policy can be helpful in the event that it is necessary to prosecute someone who has violated the policy. In creating a security policy, there's something known as a security policy cycle. Now, many organizations follow a three-phase approach, a three-phase cycle, if you would, in developing and maintaining their security policy. The first phase is a vulnerability assessment. We've spoken of these at length in the past. That's a systematic and methodological evaluation for the exposure of assets to attackers, the forces of nature, any entity that is a potential harm. Vulnerability assessment attempts to identify what needs to be protected, what pressures are against it, how susceptible the current protection is, what damages could result from the threats, and simply what we're going to do about it. Creating the policy using information from the risk management study is a key element, and it's important for us to review the policy for compliance. So, this three-phase security policy that we spoke of begins with our assessment. It then moves to creating the security policy itself. A security policy is usually not just a document, but often is a series of documents that clearly define the defense mechanisms. And the final phase is to review the policy for compliance. We add new assets, we make changes, so we must continually monitor and evaluate. And the result of the monitoring and evaluation, we again might identify a new risk, and so what happens? The policy cycle begins all over again. When creating a security policy, many organizations follow a set standard of principles, and these are often divided into what a policy must do and what a security policy should do. And this table lists those for us. A security policy should be looked at as a team effort, not just the work of one or two individuals in IT or in security. This team effort should be charged with developing the draft of the policy, determining which groups should review the policy, complete the required approval process, and determine how the policy should be implemented. Who should be on the team? Well, that's going to vary by organization, but ideally, the team should have a senior level administrator, management staff who can enforce the policy, the legal staff, and representatives from the user community. And the team needs to first decide the scope and policy of the policy. The scope really should be a statement about who is covered and it should include a goals outline about what the policy attempts to achieve. The team may also decide on how specific to make the policy. A statement regarding mandatory vacations could indicate vacations must be taken by employees, or could indicate how frequently vacations are to be taken. Now, security policies generally include statements such as due care. Due care is used frequently in legal and business settings. It's defined as the obligations that are imposed on owners and operators of assets to exercise reasonable care of those assets and to take necessary precautions to protect them. Due care is the care that a reasonable person would exercise under the circumstances. So for information security policies, due care is often used to indicate the reasonable treatment an employee would exercise when using computer equipment. Here are a couple of examples. Employees will exercise due care in opening attachments received from unknown sources. A reasonable person would not open an attachment from an unknown source because it could possibly contain malware. So that statement of due care indicates what the employee would do under these circumstances. Another, students will exercise due care when using computers in a lab setting. Again, a reasonable person would be aware that because there are many students in a crowded lab, they need to be careful when they enter their password. Now, many organizations follow guidelines when they develop a policy. These guidelines include notifying users in advance when a new policy is being developed, and they explain why the policy is needed, certainly. They provide a sample of people affected by the policy to give them an opportunity to review and comment on the policy. Before it's deployed, users have a period of time in which they can look at and review the policy, provide their input. And it will allow users, given responsibility in a policy, the authority to carry out those responsibilities. A security policy we've seen so far has many facets to it, and it very quickly can become comprehensive and very detailed. So most organizations choose to break the security policy down into what are smaller sub-policies that can be more easily referenced. So security policy then kind of becomes an umbrella term for the sub-policies that are within it. There are a large number and different types of security policies and their sub-policies. Oftentimes, the sub-policies involve this list that we have here, and we'll look at several of these. And here's a table that lists the different types of security policies and their descriptions. Not all organizations would have all of these. So let's start with the security policy, sub-policy, of acceptable use policy, the AUP. An acceptable use policy is a policy that defines the actions users may perform while they're accessing the system and network equipment. Users in this context are not limited to employees. It might include outside vendors, contractors, even visitors. And they each may have different privileges. The acceptable use policy typically covers all computer use, including internet, email, web, password security. A privacy policy has grown in importance in recent years because of increasing concern about information regarding us being private and being protected. So many organizations have a privacy policy now. Sometimes it's called a personally identifiable information policy, a PII policy. The policy outlines how the organization will use personal information that it collects. And we'll see an example of a privacy policy in an upcoming slide. Security-related human resource policy. A policy that addresses security as it relates to human resources is known as a security-related human resource policy. These policies include statements regarding how an employee's information technology resources will be addressed. Security-related human resource policies generally are presented at an orientation session when the employee is hired, and they provide the necessary information about the technology resources of the organization, how these resources are used, and of course, the acceptable use and security policies that are enforced. Generally also, the penalties for violating these policies are also outlined. Here's an example of that sample privacy policy that we spoke of just a moment ago, the PII. In general, you can visit us on the internet without telling us who you are, without giving any personal information. There are times when we or our partners may need personal information. You may choose to give us personal information in a variety of situations. Now, still talking about security-related human resource policies. These policies often may contain statements about due process. We spoke about due process just a moment ago. Again, the principle of treating all accused persons in equal fashion, using established rules and principles, is what is known as due process. So, a due process statement may indicate that any employee accused of a malicious action will be treated equally, not given preferential treatment. Policy may contain a statement regarding due diligence, or that any investigation into suspected employee conduct that is not acceptable will examine all the material facts. The security-related human resource policy generally will contain statements regarding what action will be taken when an employee is terminated. Password management and complexity policy. We've spoken before that passwords are the weakest link in information security many times. However, they're the most widely used form of authentication. Thus, a password management and complexity policy clearly addresses how passwords are to be created and managed. Now, in addition to controls that can be implemented, users should be reminded of how to select and use passwords and what the difference between a strong and a weak password is. Here's an example of weak password information that might be contained in a security policy. Simply outlines the organization's approach to passwords and what they should contain and not contain. Again, when we're talking about our policy in terms of password management and complexity, this information may be contained regarding what strong passwords should have, sometimes it's difficult to dispose of older computers. They can contain toxic or environmentally dangerous materials. So organizations oftentimes recycle older computers, maybe giving them to schools or churches or charities. And sometimes they'll sell them online if there are a large number of them. However, information needs to be deleted from the hard drive before they're recycled. And as we've spoken of in the past, sometimes that information may be hidden in the Microsoft Windows system and not completely removed. Even going through and deleting files may not necessarily remove all of the information from the hard drives. So in order to address this potential security problem, many organizations have added a disposal and destruction policy. This addresses the steps to be taken before equipment is disposed of. This policy covers how long records and data will be retained, how to dispose of equipment. Hard drives may be erased with third-party software that actually wipes the drives clean by overriding all of the data with ones and zeros. Network equipment should have any data stored in memory erased. Classification of information policy. A classification of information policy is designed to produce a standardized framework for classifying information assets. Now, usually this involves creating classification strategies, maybe low, medium, and high, and then assigning information to those categories. Classification information can be a challenge. There's often a tendency to create multiple levels of classification, or to classify everything the same, or maybe use an information classification category that was created by another organization and try to force our information, our classifications into it. So classification of information policy is good in helping to create a workable classification, but it oftentimes can be a challenge. And speaking of challenge, that leads us to perhaps one of the most challenging types of policies, an ethics policy. Our corporate world has been rocked in recent years by high-profile scandals. Once powerful organizations today are bankrupt due to the unethical and illegal actions such as insider trading. Now, these scandals have resulted in new federal legislation in an attempt to force organizations to act in a responsible manner. Many individuals believe the only way to reduce the number and magnitude of these scandals is to refocus attention on ethics in the enterprise. Now, defining ethics is a challenge, but one approach is to think of ethics in comparison to values and morals. Values may be looked at as a person's fundamental belief and principles that's used to define good and right and just. Values provide guidance in determining the right action to take for a person. Values could be classified as moral values like fairness, truth, justice, love. Pragmatic values, maybe efficiency, thrift, health, patience. And aesthetic values, maybe attractive, soft, cold, those type of things. That could be the category of values. Morals, on the other hand, are values that are attributed to a system of belief that help the individual distinguish right from wrong. These values typically derive their authority from something outside of the individual, a higher spiritual being, an external authority, perhaps such as government or society. By the way, the higher spiritual being is not equated with the external authority of government or society. Those are two separate categories. Moral concepts are based on the external authority and may vary from one society to another, and may even change over time as the society changes. So where does that leave us with ethics? We may define ethics as a study of what a group of individuals understand to be good and right behavior, and how individuals make these judgments. When people act in ways consistent with their moral values, they're said to be acting ethically. So ethics inform people how to act in ways that meet the standards that are set for themselves according to their values. It's not the goal of an organization to tell an employee what their values may be. But it is the organization's responsibility to set ethical behavior and train employees so they understand those standards within the context of the organization. Many organizations have ethics policies. This policy is a written code of conduct that's designed to be a central guide and reference for employees in supporting their day-to-day decision making. The code is intended to clarify an organization's missions, values, and principles, and then link them with standards in professional conduct. So an ethics policy can be an open disclosure of the way an organization operates and provides visible guidelines of behavior. It can also serve as a communication tool that reflects the agreement the organization has to uphold its most important values, how it's going to deal with matters as it commits to employees, its standards for doing business, its relationship to the community. We'll move now from talking about policies to talking about awareness and training. One of the key defenses in information security is that of providing security awareness and training to all users. As computer users in an organization have a shared responsibility to protect the assets of the organization, it simply can't be assumed that the users have the knowledge and the skills necessary to protect these assets. Users need training in what is important, the roles they play in security, and the steps they need to take to prevent attacks. And again, because new attacks appear on a regular basis, new security vulnerabilities are being exposed all the time, then user awareness and training is an ongoing task. Awareness and training involves instruction regarding compliance, user security practices, and the awareness of threats. And we might also consider what techniques should be used in training in order to make it useful and informative. We'll start with compliance. Users should be made aware of the organization's established security policies and the reasons why it's necessary to follow these policies. Users should be informed of such things as security policy training and procedures, that is, an understanding of the role that policies play, why they're important, and the content of these policies. Users should be made aware of the personal identifiable information and the risk of not protecting that information, particularly if it belongs to customers and third parties. Information classification, data labeling, handling, and disposal. Again, need to be made aware of how to handle and protect different types of data and how to dispose of equipment. And compliance with laws and best practices and standards, need to be aware of legislation that may affect the organization and its use and protection of customer information. Awareness and training also involves helping users understand how their normal practices may impact the security of an organization. This table lists different categories of user practices and the type of instruction that could be provided to make these practices more secure. Threat awareness. It's not uncommon for users to be just unaware of the security risk that something that they do or something that a technology just recently introduced may impact them. Two examples that we'll look at are peer-to-peer networks and social networking. Instant messaging, which users contact directly to each other without a centralized server, has a corresponding element known as peer-to-peer networking, in which users connect directly between them. A peer-to-peer network doesn't have servers, so each device functions both as a client and a server to all devices. Peer-to-peer networks are used for connecting devices such as sharing audio, video, data, maybe real-time data transmissions, such as telephony traffic. But because peer-to-peer networks communicate directly between devices, they're very often tempting targets for attackers. Some individuals are surprised to learn that viruses and worms and trojans and spywares can be sent through peer-to-peer networks, just as they can in other means. So most organizations prohibit peer-to-peer communications because of the high risk of infection and the legal consequences. Grouping individuals and organizations into like clusters or group is called social networking. Physical social networking is achieved in person at school or work, where we'll gravitate to those who have similar interests as we do. Social networking, of course, is increasingly performed online. A website that facilitates linking individuals with common interests like their hobbies, religion, politics, school contacts are called social networking sites, and they function as an online community of users, certainly. A user who's granted access to social networking can read profile pages of other members and interact with them. Social networking sites are popular not only with users but also attacker, because this is where a large amount of personal information may be available. But a second reason why these sites are so attractive to attackers is users in these sites are generally trusting, because that's the foundation of these social networking sites. Attackers may join a social networking site and pretend to be part of a network of users, maybe pretending that they went to the same high school as the user. So after a period of time, users begin to feel like they know the attackers. They may start to provide personal information or click on embedded links provided by the attacker. But of course that link may download malware. And social networking sites are vulnerable themselves. Many of these sites have become targets of attackers because of the lax or more often confusing security measures, and many of these sites are notorious for changing their security policies and the technical implementation of security almost on a weekly basis. For these reasons, users need to be instructed about being cautious regarding putting personal information on social networking sites. Now, by personal information, we mean information that applies personally to the individual, but can also be inside information regarding the company itself. So, just some general security tips. Individuals should be careful about who they accept as a friend on a social networking site. Once a person has been accepted as a friend, that person may be able to access personal information such as photographs. Another good security tip is to show limited friends a reduced version of your profile. Individuals can be designated limited friends who only have access to a smaller version of the profile. This is good for casual acquaintances or business associates. Users should disable options and then reopen them only as necessary. Disable the option until it becomes apparent that the option is needed, instead of making everything accessible and then trying to go back and restrict it after it's far too late. In using the social networking site Facebook, here are some recommended settings and an explanation of those settings. Training techniques. We've spoken of the importance of training and awareness for users, and all users need continuous training on new security defenses and to be reminded of security policies and procedures and proper behavior from a security context. There are many times when security education and training can be taught, can be used. This is a list of some. when a new employee is hired, after an attack has occurred, when an employee is promoted or given new responsibilities, during an annual departmental retreat, when new software is installed, when user hardware is upgraded. These are all excellent opportunities, when they occur, to take the time to, again, implement employee training to remind employees of the security risks that they face and to teach new security techniques that may have been implemented by the organization. One of the challenges in organizational education and training is to understand the traits of learners. Learners have different traits, and learning styles are different as well. There are some learners who are visual learners. They learn by taking notes, maybe sitting in the front of the class watching presentation. There are some learners who are auditory learners. They tend to sit in the middle of the class, and they learn best maybe through lectures and discussions. Third type is kinesthetic learners. Much of the information is learned through hands-on lab environments, and many information technology professionals are this way. Training styles can impact how individuals learn. The pedagogical approach is a classical teaching method. The andragogical approach, that's the art of helping an adult learner. And these styles are somewhat different. Here are some of those traits of learners. And here are some of those different approaches to training. Let's summarize what we've looked at in Chapter 14 regarding risk mitigation. We said that a risk is a likelihood that a threat agent will exploit a vulnerability. We've talked about privilege management and change management. We've looked at a security policy and said that it shows how an organization plans to protect its information technology assets. We've looked at development and maintenance of a security policy following a three-phase cycle. Security policies, as we said, are often broken into sub-policies, and here's a list of those sub-policies that we looked at in more detail. We said that ongoing awareness and training provides users with knowledge and skills necessary to support information security. Chapter 14, Risk Mitigation, Security Plus Guide to Network Security Fundamentals, 4th edition.